70 million Americans are medicated for something that wasn't a disease. The number hit me before the diagnosis did. 70 million. That's not a statistic you absorb immediately. It settles into you slowly, the way cold water does. 70 million Americans currently taking prescription medication for a condition that did not exist as a formal medical diagnosis before 1980. A condition that, in the single decade between 1990 and 2000, went from affecting an estimated 900,000 Americans to over 7 million. A condition whose diagnostic criteria were written, revised, and expanded by committees that included researchers with direct financial relationships to the companies manufacturing the drugs used to treat it. A condition so broad in its current definition that it can be applied to virtually any child who finds school boring, any adult who loses their keys, any person whose attention doesn't conform to the specific pattern that a mid-20th century classroom was designed to reward. I found the thread while researching something else entirely: the history of pharmaceutical marketing. And it kept pulling, because the story of how 70 million Americans came to be medicated for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is not simply a story about neuroscience or psychiatry or even pharmaceutical greed. It is a story about how a description became a diagnosis, how a diagnosis became a disease, and how a disease became a market, one of the most profitable markets in the history of medicine, in the span of a single human lifetime. And the part that keeps me up at night isn't the scale of it. It's how precisely, how methodically, how institutionally it was constructed. Step by step, vote by vote, revision by revision. I want to be honest about what this is. ADHD is one of those subjects where the conversation has been poisoned from both directions, by people who insist it is entirely fabricated and by institutions that insist it is entirely settled. I am not interested in either extreme. I am interested in the documents, the committee membership lists, the pharmaceutical funding records, the diagnostic revision histories, the prescription volume data. Because when you lay those things in sequence, the picture they form is not the one that either side of the popular debate has been describing. The official story goes like this. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is a neurodevelopmental condition characterized by persistent patterns of inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity that interfere with functioning and development. It has a neurobiological basis. Studies using brain imaging have identified structural and functional differences in specific regions of the brain, particularly the prefrontal cortex and the dopaminergic pathways that regulate executive function and attention. It is heritable, with genetic studies suggesting a heritability rate of approximately 74%, comparable to conditions like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. It affects people across their lifespan. It does not simply disappear at adolescence, as earlier medical consensus assumed. The pharmacological treatment for ADHD, stimulant medications, primarily amphetamine-based compounds and methylphenidate, has been in use since the late 1930s, when Charles Bradley discovered that benzodrine, an amphetamine, produced dramatic improvements in the behavior and academic performance of children at a Rhode Island residential school. The mechanism is counterintuitive, stimulants calming rather than exciting individuals with attention dysregulation, but it has been replicated across thousands of clinical trials and is among the most robust findings in child psychiatry. The official story holds that ADHD was formally recognized in the third edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-3, published in 1980, representing not the invention of a new disease, but the proper scientific codification of a pattern of suffering that had been observed, described, and variably named for decades. The subsequent expansion of ADHD diagnoses reflects improved awareness, reduced stigma, broader access to psychiatric evaluation, and the recognition that the condition persists into adulthood in a significant proportion of cases. That is the mainstream medical position. It is held by the American Psychiatric Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the CDC, and the vast majority of practicing psychiatrists and pediatricians. Let me be fair to the official narrative. The neurobiological differences associated with ADHD are real findings, not fabrications. The subjective suffering of people with significant attention dysregulation is real. The research supporting stimulant efficacy in reducing ADHD symptoms is genuine and substantial. Now let's look at what the official narrative prefers not to discuss. Let's start with the numbers, not the diagnostic prevalence numbers everyone cites, but the committee numbers. The specific, documented composition of the committees that wrote the diagnostic criteria. The DSM, published by the American Psychiatric Association, is the primary diagnostic framework for mental disorders in the United States. Its criteria determine what constitutes a diagnosable condition, which in turn determines what insurance companies will reimburse, what drugs the FDA will approve, and, most consequentially, how many people qualify for a given diagnosis at any moment in time. The DSM is not a scientific document in the same sense that a chemistry textbook is. It is a consensus document, a product of committee deliberation, expert opinion, and institutional negotiation. Understanding who sits on those committees is not a conspiratorial inquiry. It is basic science journalism. In 2006, a study published in the journal Psychotherapy and Psychosomatics examined the financial relationships between DSM panel members and pharmaceutical companies. The findings were striking. Of the 170 DSM panel members surveyed, 56% had one or more financial relationships with companies in the pharmaceutical industry. For the panels specifically overseeing disorders where drugs are primary treatments, mood disorders, schizophrenia, and the panel relevant to ADHD, the percentage with industry financial relationships was significantly higher. The study, conducted by researchers at Tufts University, used publicly available disclosure data. It was not speculative. It was accounting. The timing is almost theatrical. The DSM-3 in 1980 introduced attention deficit disorder. The DSM-3R in 1987 expanded the criteria and introduced the hyperactivity subtype. The DSM-4 in 1994 further broadened the diagnostic framework, notably expanding the adult symptom criteria and lowering some thresholds for diagnosis. Each revision was accompanied by an increase in diagnostic prevalence. Each revision was produced by committees with pharmaceutical industry financial relationships that were, for most of this period, either undisclosed or disclosed only to the APA itself rather than to the public. That's not coincidence. That's a structure. Which brings me to a name that appears rarely in the mainstream ADHD conversation: Keith Connors. Connors was a psychologist at Duke University who spent decades studying ADHD and developing the diagnostic rating scales, the Connors rating scales, that became the standard clinical tool for assessing ADHD symptoms. He was, by any measure, one of the architects of the modern understanding of ADHD as a clinical entity. He was not a skeptic. He believed in the diagnosis. He spent his career advancing it. And then, in 2013, at the age of 79, Connors gave an interview to the New York Times in which he described the current state of ADHD diagnosis in the United States as, in his words, a national disaster of dangerous proportions. He said that the numbers, the diagnostic prevalence rates that were being celebrated as evidence of improved awareness, were, in his judgment, a concoction. He was not saying ADHD didn't exist. He was saying that the system he had helped build had been captured by forces he hadn't anticipated, and that the result was the mass medicating of children who did not have the condition he had spent his career studying. Connors is not sitting in a filing cabinet somewhere. He gave a newspaper interview. He said this in public. And then the conversation moved on, because it is very difficult for an institution to acknowledge that one of the foundational figures in a $50 billion pharmaceutical category is describing that category as a disaster. The archive led me from Connors to something I hadn't expected: the history of direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical advertising. In 1997, the FDA relaxed its regulations on direct-to-consumer advertising for prescription medications, permitting television commercials that had previously been prohibited. The specific regulatory change allowed advertisements to name both the condition and the drug without being required to provide the full list of risks in a format that made the advertisement impractical to broadcast. Before 1997, pharmaceutical companies marketed ADHD medications primarily to physicians. After 1997, They could market directly to parents and patients. Between 1994 and 2003, ADHD medication prescriptions for adults increased by almost 90%. The period overlaps almost exactly with the post-1997 direct-to-consumer advertising window. I am not claiming this correlation is definitive causation. I am saying the timing deserves examination that it rarely receives in the official account of ADHD's expanding prevalence. Speaking of prevalence, there's a geographic anomaly in the diagnostic data that I spent considerable time trying to understand. ADHD diagnosis rates in the United States are not uniformly distributed. They vary dramatically by state, by county, by school district, in ways that are difficult to reconcile with a condition that is 74% heritable and neurobiologically based. Kentucky diagnoses ADHD in roughly 18% of its school-age children. California diagnoses it in roughly 6%. The genetic pool of Kentucky children and California children is not 300% different. The neurobiological prevalence of dopaminergic dysregulation does not respect state lines in the pattern suggested by the diagnostic data. What does vary by state? Insurance reimbursement structures, special education funding formulas tied to disability designations, the density of pediatric psychiatric practitioners, the cultural attitudes toward medication as a behavioral intervention, state-level policies on medication accommodation in schools. These factors, institutional, economic, cultural, track far more closely with the geographic variation in ADHD diagnosis rates than any neurobiological model would predict. That's not a minor footnote. That's a structural problem with the official framing of ADHD as a straightforward neurobiological condition whose prevalence reflects the actual frequency of the underlying neurology. If the diagnosis were tracking neurobiology, you would not see threefold differences in prevalence between neighboring states with similar genetic populations. What you are seeing, the pattern suggests, is the diagnosis tracking something else, something institutional, something economic, something that has more to do with how the healthcare system is organized than with how brains are wired. But here's what matters. The institutional factors driving geographic variation are never acknowledged in the public health communications about ADHD. The CDC's prevalence maps show the variation. The CDC's explanatory frameworks do not engage with what the variation implies about the nature of the diagnosis itself. I want to spend a moment on the DSM's own acknowledgement, buried in the diagnostic criteria themselves, in plain sight, of what the ADHD diagnosis actually is and is not. The DSM-5, published in 2013, includes in its description of ADHD a passage noting that many ADHD symptoms are also present in typically developing individuals, that inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity exist on a continuum in the general population, and that the diagnosis requires not merely the presence of these symptoms, but their presence at a level that causes significant impairment in multiple settings. The diagnosis is defined by a threshold on a continuum, not by the presence of a qualitatively distinct neurobiological marker. That's an important distinction. It means that where you draw the diagnostic line determines how many people qualify for the diagnosis. It means the prevalence of ADHD is, in a meaningful sense, a policy decision rather than a discovery. If you lower the symptom threshold, if you change the required number of symptoms from 8 to 6, as the DSM revision from DSM-3R to DSM-4 effectively did for certain presentations, you expand the population that qualifies for diagnosis. Not because more people have different neurobiology, but because the line moved. And who moves the line? The committee. And who sits on the committee? People with pharmaceutical industry financial relationships, in percentages that exceed 50% of the membership. I am not saying every psychiatrist who receives pharmaceutical industry funding is corrupted by it. I am not saying the researchers who serve on DSM panels are consciously adjusting diagnostic criteria to expand drug markets. What I am saying is that a system in which the same institutions that profit from a broader diagnosis are meaningfully represented in the bodies that define the breadth of that diagnosis has a structural incentive problem that the official narrative has never adequately addressed. Let me slow down here and do what the official narrative actually deserves: a fair accounting of the counterarguments. The most serious counterargument is the neuroimaging data. Studies using fMRI and structural MRI have identified consistent differences in brain structure and activity between individuals diagnosed with ADHD and control populations. Differences in the volume and activity of the prefrontal cortex, the caudate nucleus, and the cerebellum. These findings have been replicated across multiple independent research groups in multiple countries. They are not fabrications. The response to this evidence from ADHD skeptics, that the brain differences may be caused by stimulant medication itself rather than by the underlying condition, is partially addressed by studies of unmedicated ADHD populations, which show some degree of structural difference even in individuals who have never taken stimulants. The data is not clean, but it is not nothing. The second serious counterargument is the medication efficacy data. Randomized controlled trials consistently show that stimulant medications reduce ADHD symptoms, improve academic performance metrics, and reduce rates of certain adverse outcomes, accidents, substance use initiation, academic failure, in diagnosed populations. These findings are genuine and have been replicated widely. The third counterargument is the most human one. The testimony of individuals who received ADHD diagnoses and treatment and described their lives as fundamentally transformed by both. That testimony is real. That experience is real. Whatever the institutional mechanics of how the diagnosis was constructed and expanded, the subjective experience of people who report that it described something real about their minds deserves respect. All of that is true. All of it sits alongside the institutional record. And the institutional record doesn't disappear because the subjective testimony is genuine. What no one explains is the speed. Between 1990 and 2013, global ADHD medication sales went from approximately $400 million annually to over $9 billion. That is a 22-fold increase in 23 years. The United States accounts for approximately 75 to 80% of global ADHD medication consumption, despite representing roughly 4% of the world's population. Americans consume somewhere between 15 and 20 times more ADHD medication per capita than the global average. Those numbers have a shape. That shape is not the shape of a global neurobiological condition being consistently identified and treated. That shape is the shape of a specific national market, developed through specific institutional mechanisms, producing specific commercial outcomes for specific corporate beneficiaries. The neurobiological variation between American children and European children is not 20-fold. The diagnostic and pharmaceutical infrastructure variation is. The leading ADHD medications, Adderall, Ritalin, Concerta, Vyvanse, generated combined revenues exceeding $13 billion in 2023 in the United States alone. Vyvanse, manufactured by Takeda Pharmaceuticals, generated approximately $3.8 billion in 2022, making it one of the highest-grossing psychiatric medications in pharmaceutical history. These are not trivial numbers. These are numbers that explain why a specific diagnostic category receives the institutional attention and advocacy that ADHD receives. They are the numbers that answer the question of who benefits from a broader diagnostic definition. I am not saying the medications don't work for the people they help. I am saying that $13 billion in annual revenue creates institutional pressures that operate independently of whether the medications help. Pressures on research funding, on advocacy organization financing, on the career trajectories of researchers, on the composition of the committees that define who qualifies for treatment. These pressures are not hypothetical. They are documented in the financial disclosure records that are available, imperfectly, through academic journal policies and pharmaceutical industry reporting requirements. There is a human element to this that the pharmaceutical revenue numbers obscure. In 1990, a child diagnosed with ADHD was statistically unusual. The diagnosis carried social weight. It described something that most parents and teachers recognized as genuinely impairing: a child who could not function in ordinary educational and social settings without significant support. The diagnosis was a doorway to services, accommodations, and therapeutic support that those children genuinely needed. By 2023, a child diagnosed with ADHD was statistically ordinary in many American school districts, present in numbers that strain the credibility of any neurobiological model of prevalence. And the diagnosis had acquired a new social function alongside its clinical one. It was a gateway to academic accommodations, extended testing time, reduced course loads, and, at the college level, access to stimulant medications that enhance performance in neurotypical individuals as well as in those with genuine attention dysregulation. That last point is the one that institutional ADHD advocacy consistently avoids. Stimulant medications improve certain cognitive performance metrics in individuals with and without ADHD. They are performance-enhancing drugs in a meaningful pharmacological sense. The demand for ADHD diagnosis among college students, which has produced its own epidemic of college-age ADHD diagnoses, is not fully separable from the demand for legal access to stimulant medication in a competitive academic environment. These incentives interact with the diagnostic system in ways that expand diagnosis beyond the population that the diagnosis was originally designed to identify. The original children, the ones whose suffering Keith Connors spent his career trying to understand and alleviate, are still there. Their experience is real. Their need for support is real. And they are now part of a diagnostic category so broad that it has become almost impossible to distinguish them from the vast population of people whose ordinary neurodiversity, ordinary childhood energy, and ordinary adult distractibility has been reframed as a medical condition requiring pharmaceutical management. I don't have answers. I have patterns. The pattern suggests that the diagnostic category of ADHD was systematically expanded through a series of DSM revisions produced by committees with substantial pharmaceutical industry financial relationships, and that each expansion was followed by increases in diagnostic prevalence and medication revenue. The pattern suggests that the geographic distribution of ADHD diagnoses tracks institutional and economic variables more closely than neurobiological ones, implying that the diagnosis is measuring something more complex than simple neurological prevalence. The pattern suggests that the direct-to-consumer advertising liberalization of 1997 coincides with a dramatic increase in adult ADHD diagnoses and medication prescriptions. The pattern suggests that the primary architect of the clinical rating scales used to diagnose ADHD publicly described the current diagnostic landscape as a disaster before the conversation moved on without engaging with his concern. The pattern suggests that 70 million Americans are medicated for a condition whose diagnostic boundaries were drawn, revised, and redrawn by people with financial interests in the breadth of those boundaries. Maybe none of that adds up to what I think it adds up to. Maybe the pharmaceutical funding of DSM researchers is disclosed, managed, and effectively ring-fenced from the deliberative process. Maybe the geographic variation in diagnosis rates reflects legitimate variation in access to psychiatric care rather than institutional and economic factors driving overdiagnosis. Maybe the 22-fold increase in medication revenue reflects genuine expansion of treatment access to a previously underdiagnosed population rather than the commercial expansion of a diagnostic market. Maybe. But the Tufts study exists. Keith Connors' 2013 interview exists. The geographic prevalence maps exist. The pharmaceutical revenue disclosures exist. The DSM revision histories exist. The direct-to-consumer advertising regulatory change exists. These are not claims. They are documents. They are records. They are sitting in academic journals, in pharmaceutical industry filings, in FDA regulatory archives, in the publicly available meeting minutes of the American Psychiatric Association's DSM revision working groups, buried in plain sight. And 70 million Americans are taking medication every day, medication that alters dopamine and norepinephrine signaling in developing and developed brains, for a condition whose diagnostic boundaries were determined by a process that has never been adequately insulated from the commercial interests of the people who profit most from those boundaries being drawn as broadly as possible. That is the question that deserves to be asked loudly in the mainstream conversation about mental health in America. Not whether ADHD exists, not whether medication helps some people, but whether the institutional process that decides who qualifies for a diagnosis, and therefore who gets medicated, is structurally capable of producing a reliable answer to those questions when the financial incentives all point in one direction. The archive is open. The disclosure records are available. The committee membership lists are on file with the American Psychiatric Association. The pharmaceutical revenue data is in the annual reports of publicly traded companies. Everything needed to evaluate this question is accessible to anyone willing to look. The question is whether the institutions that benefit from our not asking it will let the answer be heard. And once you start asking it, you cannot stop.